Welcome to the Plagues Project.
And Plagues, many angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
We live in a terrible time of plague, human suffering, human death on a global scale. What does the Jewish tradition have to say about plague and our responses to it as a spiritual community? In this session, I'm going to take you on a journey through Kabbalistic ideas about plague and spiritual responses to it, because it turns out that in Kabbalah, and perhaps even very, very deep into the early Jewish tradition, plague plays a crucial role in thinking about spirituality, in thinking about God, in thinking about human beings' relationship to God and their own spirit. I begin with an esoteric book, a secret book, the Zohar, the main work of Kabbalah, written in the 13th century. And I'm going to start with a quote from a secret book within this secret book, a book called the Book of King Solomon, but it's not any book that you have read or could be on your shelf. It's the Zohar's secret library, whose traces we only know about from the pages of the Zohar itself. Ashkachna v'sifra de Shlomo Malka, ketoret hu lechedva, u'lesalka motana. I found in the book of King Solomon, incense is for joy and to get rid of the plague. This juxtaposition of joy and plague as opposites is something that will accompany us throughout our journey here. What is the relationship between these two? Why are they opposites? Let us look a little bit more from the book of King Solomon. Why? Why does incense turn plague into joy? Because judgment is found in the external, and joy and happiness and bonding and light are from the internal. And when the internal arouses, all judgment departs, and therefore, incense stands to nullify the plague. Ketoret kaima levatla motana. The salka motana, to get rid of the plague. That is the power of incense. And before exploring as to why this text says that, since we are living in the time of plague, it seems like a good time to light some incense. And so I raised my censer, my incense burner, bought on the streets of Manhattan in pre-plague days. And I intend this incense to serve the goal, the salka motana, to get rid of the plague. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei atzei b'samim. Let us explore why there is this connection between incense and plague in our tradition. The Sefer HaZohar, the book I just read to you from, the Book of Splendor, was written in Spain in the late 13th century, in Castile mostly, and was printed in the 16th century in Italy. And here's a page from one of the early editions, the early Italian editions of the Zohar, printed in Mantua. Now the Zohar is known as a book of light. And this is another work from the same period in Spain, the Gates of Light, Share Ora, with a very famous woodcut illustration in the opening pages of it. This is from an edition printed in the 16th century of a Latin translation of this work. And it shows what people often think of as a Kabbalist, an old man sitting there tending the tree of the 10 Sfirot, which are the 10 archetypes that make up of the cosmos in Kabbalistic mythology. But Kabbalah is not only about light. It is also about confrontation with the darkest, the most sinister, the most troubling, unsettling features of human existence. It's also a confrontation with the demonic. Now here we have a famous architectural relief from the 3rd millennium BC of some kind of goddess of the night. Many scholars think it is the goddess or demoness Lilith. Some think it isn't. In any event, a mysterious, possibly Lilith representation. Lilith, as we will see, plays a large role in the Kabbalistic imagination, and Kabbalah forces us to face such primordial figures rooted deep in the human imagination, unsettling to some, also inspiring to some. Now, Lilith became a big part of the Jewish imagination with Kabbalah, but already for many centuries earlier, Lilith played a very large role in the Jewish imagination, although she came into Judaism from outside. And people would write amulets to protect themselves from Lilith. And here is an amulet designed particularly to protect newborn children and mothers who had just given birth. People continue to write such amulets even to this very day. So Kabbalah introduces us to this other side, the sinister side, the scary side, maybe even inspiring side of the cosmos, and also teaches us how to confront it, to protect ourselves from it, perhaps to get in touch with it without being overwhelmed by it. Now, I'm going to look at one particular story from the Torah about plague. And this is a sequel to a more famous story. The famous story is the story of Korach. Korach was a rebel against the authority of Moses and Aaron in the desert, challenged their assertion of hierarchical rule, and God became furious at them, and the earth opened up, and Korach and 250 of his followers were swallowed up by the earth. But that's not the story I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what happened afterwards. Afterwards, the rest of the Israelites were terrified and also a bit freaked out that so many people had been swallowed up by the earth. So they complained. And I'm going to just read it in English. And on the morrow, in other words, the day after the swallowing up of Korach and his followers by the earth, on the morrow, all the congregation of the people of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, saying, "You have killed the people of God." And God, Yudhe said to Moses, "Get away from the midst of this congregation that I may consume them in a moment." God's threatening to exterminate all the Israelites, and they fell on their faces. And Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer, take your incense burner, your incense holder, the way I did just a moment ago, and put fire therein from off the altar and lay incense on it and carry it quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them. For wrath has gone forth from God, the plague has begun." The plague here deeply associated with God's anger, with God's fury. So Aaron took as Moses said and ran into the midst of the assembly, and behold, the plague had already begun among the people. And he put on the incense and made atonement for the people. And he stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stopped. Now I ask you to imagine this scene. The high priest standing amongst the dying and living with his incense holder held high, and the plague stops. And we want to find out what is that mystery. Now those who died by the plague were 14,700, besides those who died in the affair of Korach. 14,700 people killed more or less indiscriminately by this plague after the people dared to murmur against God. And here is an image of this scene, the fire and the smoke, and Moses and Aaron standing there, and Aaron getting ready to hold his incense up to stop the plague. What is it about incense that stops the plague? Now, in the Zohar, there are many, many retellings of this story, and an attempt to explain this connection between plague and incense. Now I'm going to read one of these retellings right now. The desert plague and the magical power of incense, I call this passage. Come and see. Incense binds together bonds and cleaves above and below. So there's something about incense that unites, brings things together. That somehow plague is associated with things being disunited, with things being ruptured. And incense, I'm in the third line here, makes death, accusation, and wrath pass away, so that they cannot rule in the world. Death, accusation, and wrath. As is written, Moses said to Aaron, take your censer and lay incense on it and carry it quickly to the congregation, for wrath has gone forth from God, the plague has begun. And it is written, I continue with the Zohar, and he stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stopped. Why? For no evil dimensions or accusers can withstand incense. So it is joy of all, the binding together of all. Somehow the incense cures evil and accusation and plague and brings things together and creates joy. Now, I caution to say, this is not a substitute for medical treatment and scientific treatment. This is an internal spiritual practice, as we saw in the beginning. Now, before I give the full Kabbalistic explanation for the power of incense, I want to look at briefly at one other story about plague in the Tanakh. And this is from the book of Chronicles from Divrei Yamim. And it's a story of King David committing a sin, a somewhat mysterious sin. He dared to conduct a census of the people of Israel, and this made God furious. I won't go into why that might have made God furious, but I want to get just to the plague part. God becomes furious, and he sends plague. And God sent a plague against Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell. 70,000. And Elohim sent a messenger to Jerusalem to destroy it. And as he destroyed, as the messenger was destroying, God saw and regretted the evil and said to the messenger who was sowing destruction, enough, stay your hand. Now look what it says. Look what this verse says. God saw and regretted the evil. And the Hebrew is vayinachem al hara'ah. This evil that came forth from God in his fury at the census that caused him first to kill 70,000 men of Israel through plague, again, the most indiscriminate killer. And then he sees, oh my God, as it were, evil came forth from me. And he says to his messenger who's wreaking the destruction, enough, now stay your hand. What is the meaning of this verse that says that evil comes forth from God? And on this, the Zohar has much to say. For the Zohar, God's anger is an emanation of judgment, God's judgment, and it is very dangerous because it can get out of control. And this is a passage that doesn't try to justify God's anger or God's anger getting out of control, but tries to look through a set of images at the consequences, the unintended consequences of out of control divine anger. For when smoke issues forth from fierce anger, this smoke expands and goes forth, anger upon anger, this upon this riding upon and dominating this with the appearance of male and female, so that all becomes fierce anger. So when God gets angry, the entire cosmos becomes filled with anger, becomes an angry cosmos. And forms start taking shape in this smoke which seems so insubstantial, a byproduct of the fire of divine anger. It starts taking form as male and female. Imagine watching smoke in a campfire late at night. You start to see images in it. But because it's coming out of the divine, these images start taking on substance. Then the smoke of rage spreads out crookedly like a serpent, sly and dangerous. And we know, of course, that the serpent is identified in the Torah with temptation and sin, and in Kabbalah with the demonic. He is a level of darkness. He goes up and down, roaming and hovering until he rests in his place by settling with another level that issues from the smoke that emerges from rage. So there's divine anger, there's fire, there's smoke, and then from the smoke, the serpent comes and settles in his place. He acquires a place in the cosmos. This byproduct of divine anger now acquires a place in the cosmos. And the male, because these two figures are male and female, the male is called shadow, also called in the Zohar Samael, the devil. A shadow in another place called death, his female consort, Lilith. When the two are combined, they are called the shadow of death. The shadow of death is, in Hebrew, one word, salmavet. which many people are familiar with from Psalm 23. Gam ki elech b'geit salmavet, yea, though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death. In the Zohar, this is a name for the male and female devils when they are united in their most dangerous form. And they are byproducts. Literally, they are consolidations or crystallizations of divine anger. So here you have an entire myth of evil coming forth from God, in fact, the diabolical coming forth from God. But we already had it in the Tanakh, where it literally says, God regretted the evil. What evil? The evil that came forth from God in his anger. So what do? We have these diabolical figures. What do we do about this fire of divine wrath? Answer, you guessed it, incense. A very closely related passage in the Zohar, although in a very different volume. I call this passage, God takes a deep breath, bringing to an end his thoughtless anger. And how? Through incense. We know that when someone gets angry, one often says to them, cool off, take a step back, take a deep breath, we say to people. Why? Because when you take a deep breath, you get a control of yourself. Instead of being out of control angry, you take a deep breath and you reconnect all your different emotions. And that's exactly what the Zohar says one does with God. Come and see. And the Zohar loves to say, come and see. It's a very visionary book. Fire issues from within, and then smoke ascends. Of this is written, they shall place incense in thy nose. For fire returns to its site. The fire of divine anger that came forth and became autonomous returns inward. And through that aroma, the deep divine breath at the nose contracts inward, till all is embraced, returning to its site. And all comes near within thought and becomes one will. So the divine breath brings divine emotion back in touch with divine thought. And instead of being out of control, the divine gets centered again. All comes near within thought and becomes one will. And then he inhaled the sweet savor. That's actually from a verse relating to Noah. When Noah offers the sacrifice after the flood, and obviously the flood is the great expression of divine anger in the Bible, he inhales sweet savor, and his anger is appeased. For anger rests, and it becomes tranquility. And when all becomes embraced, each with the other, all the components of the divine personality become embraced, each with the other, and anger is appeased, then there is tranquility. Tranquility of the spirit, the joy of all as one. Joy as being centeredness, of bringing together all the disconnected elements of the person. The shining of lamps, the shining of faces. And therefore it is written, and God inhaled the sweet savor, as one who inhales and gathers all into its place. The Zohar explicitly compares the incense offering to God to a human who inhales and gets control of themselves, or becomes reunited with themselves. Now, let's go back to plague and the reading of the desert plague. Remember, Aaron stood between the living and the dead. Well, the Zohar has an interpretation of that. Instead of Aaron standing between the living humans and the living dead, and the human dead, Aaron is standing between the cosmic dimensions of life and death, the tree of life and the tree of death. We know that in the Garden of Eden, we talk about two trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. When they become separated, and for the Zohar, that's an image of the separation of male and female, of mercy and judgment, of the various dimensions of the cosmos. When they become separated, one of the trees becomes a tree of death, and that death comes in due to separation. Let's look at what the Zohar says in this interpretation of the desert plague story. Incense, which is internal, again, that's that idea that it's an internal spiritual thing, incense. Incense, which is internal, and all that which is in mystery is given to the priest. And here the priest is almost like the arch Kabbalist, someone who knows the secret of how to bring the universe together. And therefore, and Aaron ran into the congregation and placed the incense, which is the internal, the mystery of the priest. And he stood between the dead and the living, between the tree of life and the tree of death. He's reuniting the divine that had become ruptured and therefore giving rise to death and plague and suffering. And then the right hand is represents the priest in the Zohar, the Kabbalist, brought them together, and the plague was stopped. By bringing things together, bringing together what was ruptured, getting in touch between the internal and the external, between emotion and thought, and the plague was stopped. And again, I caution, this is not a substitute for medicine and scientific precautions and all the things that we're all doing. This is about an internal spiritual practice of facing the crisis that we are in through the practice of the incense ritual. And the Zohar concludes, happy is the lot of the priest. And again, for the Zohar, the priest here is very much their image of themselves, of the Kabbalists. For the priest has power above and power below, and he brings about peace above and peace below, bringing together the divine and the human, the earthly and the heavenly, judgment and mercy, the divine and the demonic, mending the rupture internally, mending the rupture in society, mending the rupture in the cosmos. Now, I want to conclude with a passage not from a Kabbalistic text, but rather from the Talmud. Several centuries, more than half a millennium before Kabbalah started. The Talmud has many stories that could easily fit into a Kabbalistic text, although they're not. And this is a story told by Rabbi Joshua ben Joshua ben Levi. Many interesting stories told by him, actually. And it's a story about when Moses ascended to the heaven. And Rabbi Joshua tells this story about how when Moses ascended to the heaven, this was before the Torah was given to the Israelites, the angels started arguing with Moses, about the Torah. They said, you shouldn't get the Torah. You're just human beings. We should get the Torah. We're angels. We deserve the Torah more than you. And Moses argued with them, and he eventually convinced them, and he won the argument. He convinced them that the Israelites deserved the Torah more than the angels. And I'm going to go to the end of this very long story. And once he convinced them, it says this. Each angel was moved to love him, to love Moses, and bestowed something upon him. As it is said, you ascended on high, you received gifts. Which is not really what that verse means in context, but they use it for this. You ascended on high, you received gifts. He received gifts from all the angels. You received gifts. Even the angel of death bestowed something upon him. Now I wonder what present the angel of death gave to Moses. And here is what it was. For it is said, and Aaron put on the incense and made atonement for the people, and he stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stopped. And if you remember back, or if you look it up in Numbers chapter 17, Bamidbar 17, you'll see that Moses gives this instruction to Aaron. He's not told to do it by God. He just tells Aaron to go take the incense and go rush into the middle of the dying people. And the Talmud concludes, had the angel of death not told it to Moses, how could he have known it? How else could you possibly have known it, the Talmud asks. It must be because this was the present given by the angel of death to Moses in the heavens. I conclude with this story because I think what the story is really saying is that we must confront our fears, we must confront our own sinister sides, we must confront our own mortality, we must look it right in the eye and try to understand how it fits in, and try to understand what tasks it might be assigning to us. It's not to minimize the suffering and the evil and the death that we are experiencing right now in the world, but it's saying we should look at it. We should look at it, and maybe there's a present that's going to be given to us that will teach us how to heal ourselves. And this is the present given by the angel of death, gives Moses the present of the incense ritual. Because in order to heal the ruptures within ourselves, we must face those ruptures. And so again, I raise my censer and pray that pretty soon in our days, we will be able to fulfill the saying of the Zohar, Lisalka Motana, to get rid of the plague. Lisalka Motana.